The desert wind carried whispers of change across the barren landscape of Arizona Territory, where Josh McKenna had carved out his small ranch with nothing but determination and sweat. The year was 1887, and the land stretched endlessly in every direction, painted in shades of red clay and golden sand that seemed to hold secrets older than memory itself. Josh stood on his front porch, watching the horizon with eyes that had seen too much for a man barely 30 years old. His weathered hands gripped the wooden railing as he observed three figures approaching in the distance. The morning sun cast long shadows behind them, making their movements appear almost ghost-like against the vast emptiness of the desert floor. As they drew closer, Josh could make out their distinctive silhouettes. Three young Apache women, walking with purpose across his land. His first instinct was to reach for the rifle that hung beside his door, but something in their posture gave him pause. They weren't moving like raiders or threats. Instead, they walked with a measured grace that spoke of ancient traditions and deep respect for the land they traversed. The tallest of the three women appeared to be in her early 20s, with long black hair that caught the sunlight like polished obsidian. Her companions looked younger, perhaps 16 and 18, and all three wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with intricate beadwork that seemed to tell stories in every carefully placed pattern. Josh had heard the stories from other ranchers in the territory. Apache raids had been common in recent years, though most of the fighting had moved further south. Still, tensions ran high between the white settlers and the native tribes, and trust was a luxury few could afford in this harsh land where survival often depended on quick decisions and quicker triggers. As the women approached his property line, Josh noticed something unusual. They had stopped at what appeared to be an invisible boundary, as if respecting some ancient protocol that he couldn't understand. The tallest woman stepped forward and began to speak in Apache, her voice carrying across the distance with a musical quality that seemed at odds with the harsh environment surrounding them. Josh didn't understand the words, but he could sense the formality in her tone. She was asking for something, perhaps permission to cross his land or access to the water source that bubbled up from an underground spring near his cabin. The spring had been one of the main reasons he'd chosen this particular spot to build his ranch, knowing that water was life itself in this unforgiving landscape. After a moment of internal debate, Josh stepped down from his porch and walked slowly toward the three women, keeping his hands visible and away from any weapons. As he approached, he could see the intricate markings on their faces and hands, not war paint, but something more ceremonial and deeply personal. The design seemed to flow like rivers across their skin, telling stories that spoke of heritage, family, and spiritual connection to the land. The eldest woman, whose name he would later learn was Ayana, meaning eternal blossom, watched him approach with eyes that held both wariness and hope. She spoke again in Apache, this time accompanied by hand gestures that were clearly meant to communicate across the language barrier that stood between them. Josh responded with his own gestures, pointing to himself and, then, to the land around them, trying to convey that this was his home but that he meant no immediate harm. The conversation was awkward and filled with misunderstandings, but gradually a basic communication began to emerge between them. Through a combination of broken Spanish, simple English words that Ayana had picked up from previous encounters with settlers, and an elaborate system of hand signals, Josh learned that the three women were traveling to a sacred site that lay on the far side of his property. They had been walking for days, carrying with them ceremonial items that were essential for a coming-of-age ritual that would mark the transition of the two younger women into full adulthood within their tribe. The second woman, Itzel, whose name meant Rainbow Lady, was quieter but possessed an intensity that seemed to burn behind her dark eyes. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had already faced hardships beyond her years, and the markings on her arms told of achievements and trials that Josh could only guess at. The youngest, Xochitl, meaning flower, had a gentle demeanor that contrasted with the harsh environment she navigated with such apparent ease. Her markings were newer, less elaborate than those of her companions, but they held a beauty that spoke of potential and dreams yet to be realized. As the afternoon wore on, Josh found himself drawn into their story despite his initial reservations. The three women had traveled from their reservation, several days' walk to the north, to reach a particular canyon that held special significance for their people. It was a place where young women had come for generations to receive visions and guidance for their adult lives. However, their journey had been complicated by recent changes in territorial boundaries and the increasing presence of white settlers who didn't understand or respect the ancient pathways that crisscrossed the landscape. several ranchers had already turned them away, forcing them to take longer and more dangerous routes through areas where water was scarce and the risk of getting lost was high. Josh listened to their story with growing interest and concern. He had come to this land seeking solitude and a chance to build something meaningful with his own hands, but he had never considered that his presence might be disrupting patterns of life that had existed long before the first Europeans set foot on this continent. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Josh made a decision that would change the course of all their lives. Instead of simply allowing them to pass through his land, he offered them food, water, and a safe place to rest for the night before continuing their journey. The offer was met with surprise and careful consideration among the three women. They spoke quietly among themselves in Apache, weighing the risks and benefits of accepting hospitality from a white settler they had just met. The recent history between their peoples was filled with betrayals and broken promises, making trust a precious commodity that was not given lightly. Ayanna finally stepped forward and, in her careful English, accepted Josh's offer on behalf of her companions. However, she made it clear that they would not impose on his generosity without offering something in return. From the pack she carried, she produced a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. When she opened it, Josh saw that it contained herbs and other natural medicines that were unknown to him but clearly valuable to her people. That evening, as they sat around a small fire outside Josh's cabin, an extraordinary thing began to happen. Despite the language barriers and cultural differences that separated them, the four individuals began to find common ground in their shared humanity and their connection to the land they all called home. Josh learned that Ayanna was not just any young woman, but someone who held a special position within her tribe as a keeper of traditional knowledge. The markings on her face and hands weren't just decorative, they were a form of written language that recorded important information about medicinal plants, seasonal patterns, and spiritual practices that had been passed down through countless generations. Itzel, despite her youth, was already recognized as a skilled tracker and hunter, someone whose abilities had helped her people survive during the difficult years of displacement and conflict. The markings on her arms chronicled her achievements and the vision she had received during her own coming-of-age ceremony several years earlier. Xochitl was approaching her own transition into adulthood, and this journey was meant to culminate in a ceremony that would determine her path in life. The markings she already bore told of her artistic abilities and her deep connection to the spiritual aspects of Apache culture. As they shared their evening meal, Josh found himself telling them about his own journey to this place. He had come west after losing his family farm in Missouri to debt and drought, carrying nothing but hope and a determination to build a new life in a land where hard work and perseverance still meant something. The ranch he had built was modest but growing. He raised a small herd of cattle and horses, maintained a garden that provided most of his food, and had slowly been improving the buildings and fences that defined his property. It was a solitary life, but one that had given him a sense of purpose and achievement that he had never experienced in his previous existence. What struck him most about his conversation with the three Apache women was how similar their goals actually were. They too were seeking to build meaningful lives connected to the land, to honor the past while adapting to an uncertain future, and to find ways to preserve what was most important to them despite the challenges posed by a rapidly changing world. As the fire burned lower and the desert night wrapped around them like a blanket studded with countless stars, Josh realized that this encounter was more than just a chance meeting between strangers. Something had brought these three women to his doorstep, and their presence was awakening feelings and thoughts that he hadn't experienced since losing his own family years earlier. The markings on their skin, which he had initially seen as exotic and foreign, began to take on new meaning as he learned more about their significance. They weren't just decorations or even just cultural symbols, they were living documents that connected these women to their ancestors, their land, and their future in ways that his own culture had somehow forgotten how to achieve. When it came time to settle in for the night, Josh offered his guests the use of his cabin while he made himself comfortable in the small barn where he housed his horses. The gesture was met with gratitude but also with insistence that such generosity was unnecessary. Eventually, they compromised, with Josh sleeping on his front porch while the women made their beds near the still glowing embers of their fire. As he lay under the star-filled sky, listening to the soft conversations in Apache that drifted across the yard, Josh found himself thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment. The loneliness he had felt for so long seemed less pressing somehow, replaced by a curiosity about these three remarkable women and the world they represented. He thought about the markings he had seen on their skin and wondered what stories his own life might tell if it were written in such a permanent and visible way. The scars from years of hard labor, the lines around his eyes from squinting against the desert sun, the calluses on his hands from building his ranch from nothing, perhaps these were his own form of markings, telling the story of his journey to this place and this moment. The desert night was filled with sounds that had become familiar to him over the years, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the whisper of wind through the canyon walls that surrounded his property. But, tonight, those sounds seemed different somehow, imbued with new meaning by the presence of people who understood their language in ways that he was only beginning to appreciate. As sleep finally claimed him, Josh's last conscious thought was a recognition that tomorrow would bring decisions that could alter the course of his carefully planned solitary life. The three Apache women lying near his fire represented a world that was both foreign and familiar, challenging and enriching, dangerous and full of unexpected possibilities. The markings on their skin had begun to work their own kind of magic on him, opening his eyes to connections and meanings that he had never considered before. Their journey to the sacred canyon was just beginning, but somehow Josh sensed that his own journey was about to take a turn that would require all the courage and wisdom he could muster. Dawn broke across the desert with the gentle insistence of a new beginning, painting the eastern sky in soft pastels that gradually gave way to the brilliant gold of full sunrise. Josh woke to find the three Apache women already stirring around the rekindled fire, preparing what appeared to be a traditional breakfast using ingredients they had brought with them combined with water from his spring. The sight of them moving with such quiet efficiency in the early morning light struck him as both beautiful and slightly surreal. Here were people whose ancestors had called this land home for countless generations, now preparing to continue a journey that connected them to traditions older than any written history he knew. Ayanna looked up as Josh approached the fire and offered him a cup of something that steamed invitingly in the cool morning air. The drink had an earthy, complex flavor that was unlike anything he had tasted before, part herbal tea, part something more substantial that seemed to provide both warmth and energy for the day ahead. Through their evolving communication of words, gestures, and shared understanding, Josh learned that the women needed to reach the sacred canyon within the next 2 days to align with the lunar cycle that was essential for Xochitl's ceremony. However, the route they had planned was no longer safe due to recent conflicts between Apache bands and territorial militias that had made certain areas effectively impassable. The alternative routes would add several days to their journey, potentially causing them to miss the crucial timing that made the ceremony meaningful. Josh found himself faced with a decision that went far beyond simple hospitality. They needed guidance and protection through lands that he knew better than almost anyone, but providing such assistance would inevitably involve him in conflicts and complications that could threaten everything he had built. As he considered their situation, Josh realized that his own knowledge of the local terrain might be the key to solving their problem. During his years of exploring the canyons and mesas around his ranch, he had discovered several ancient pathways that seemed to have been carved by people who understood the landscape in ways that modern travelers had forgotten. These routes were often hidden from casual observation, following natural contours and taking advantage of water sources and shelter that weren't obvious to someone unfamiliar with their secrets. More importantly, they avoided the main travel corridors where conflicts were most likely to occur. Josh made his offer carefully, understanding the weight of what he was proposing. He would guide them to the sacred canyon using the hidden routes he had discovered, ensuring that they arrived in time for the ceremony while avoiding the dangers that threatened their original path. In return, he asked only for the opportunity to learn more about their culture and the meanings behind the markings that had fascinated him since their first meeting. The three women conferred among themselves for a long time, speaking in rapid Apache that occasionally included words Josh could recognize from the previous evening's conversations. He could sense that they were weighing not just the practical benefits of his offer, but also the deeper implications of accepting help from someone outside their tribe, especially a white settler whose people had been responsible for so much conflict and displacement. Finally, Ayanna stepped forward with a counteroffer that surprised Josh with its complexity and thoughtfulness. They would accept his guidance, but only if he was willing to participate in certain preparatory rituals that would make him, in a limited sense, a temporary member of their traveling party. This would require him to accept certain markings on his own skin, not the elaborate designs that told their life stories, but simpler symbols that would identify him as someone under their protection and committed to their mission. The proposal was both thrilling and terrifying to Josh. The markings they described were temporary, made with plant dyes that would fade within a few weeks, but accepting them would represent a crossing of cultural boundaries that few white men in the territory would even consider. More importantly, it would mean acknowledging that their mission was important enough to risk his own safety and social standing. Without fully understanding all the implications of his decision, Josh agreed to their terms. The marking ceremony that followed was unlike anything he had ever experienced, combining elements that seemed both ancient and, surprisingly, personal. Using brushes made from plant fibers and dyes prepared from local materials, Ayanna carefully painted symbols on his forehead, cheeks, and hands while explaining their meanings in the mixture of languages they had developed. The symbols identified him as a guide and protector, someone who had been granted temporary permission to assist in sacred work. But they also carried obligations. He was now responsible for the safety and success of their mission in ways that went beyond simple guidance through difficult terrain. As the markings dried on his skin, Josh felt a strange transformation taking place within himself. The symbols seemed to connect him to the landscape around him in new ways, making him more aware of subtle signs and patterns that he had never noticed before. Whether this was psychology or something more profound, he couldn't say, but the effect was undeniable. They set out from his ranch in the late morning, after Josh had made arrangements for his animals and secured his property for what might be an extended absence. The route he had planned would take them through some of the most spectacular and challenging terrain in the territory, following paths that required both physical endurance and constant attention to potentially dangerous conditions. The first day of their journey took them through a series of narrow canyons that provided both shelter and concealment but demanded careful navigation around rockfalls and flash flood zones. Josh had explored these areas many times, but never with the sense of purpose and responsibility that now drove him forward. As they traveled, the three women continued to teach him about their culture and the significance of the ceremony they were approaching. Xochitl's transition to adulthood would involve receiving visions that would guide her path in life, possibly revealing whether she was meant to become a healer, a storyteller, a warrior, or something else entirely. The sacred canyon they were heading toward was believed to be a place where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds were particularly thin, allowing for communications that weren't possible elsewhere. Josh learned that the markings on their skin were not just cultural decorations but served practical purposes as well. Certain symbols indicated their level of knowledge about medicinal plants, their status within the tribe, and their spiritual connections to various aspects of the natural world. The markings also served as a form of protection, marking them as people under the care of specific spiritual guardians who watched over travelers and ceremonies. During their first evening on the trail, camped in a sheltered alcove beneath overhanging rocks, Josh experienced something that challenged his understanding of reality itself. As the women prepared for sleep with ritual prayers and songs, he began to see things in the firelight and shadows that seemed impossible yet undeniably present. The markings on their skin appeared to move and shift in the flickering light, creating patterns that told stories he could somehow understand without words. He saw visions of the land as it had been before white settlers arrived, populated by people who lived in harmony with natural cycles and spiritual forces that modern civilization had largely forgotten. Whether these visions were real or simply the product of exhaustion, stress, and cultural displacement, Josh couldn't determine. But they affected him profoundly, opening his mind to possibilities and connections that he had never considered before. He began to understand that the markings were not just symbols but living connections to a worldview that was both ancient and surprisingly relevant to his own search for meaning and purpose. The second day brought them into higher country, where the air was thinner but the views were spectacular. Josh's route took them along ridgelines that offered commanding vistas of the surrounding territory while providing natural concealment from anyone who might be tracking them from below. The physical demands of the journey were considerable, but Josh was impressed by the endurance and skill of his companions, who seemed to move through the challenging terrain with an ease that spoke of lifelong conditioning and intimate knowledge of how to travel efficiently in such conditions. During a rest stop beside a hidden spring, Itzel shared with Josh some of her own story, speaking in the careful English that all three women seemed to understand much better than they initially let on. She had received her adult markings during a vision quest that had lasted 4 days and nights, during which she had encountered spiritual guides who showed her that her path lay in protecting and preserving traditional knowledge that was in danger of being lost forever. The visions she described were both beautiful and terrifying, involving journeys through spiritual landscapes that paralleled the physical geography of their homeland. She had learned to read signs in nature that most people never noticed, subtle changes in animal behavior that warned of approaching weather, patterns in plant growth that indicated underground water sources, and other forms of natural intelligence that could mean the difference between life and death in challenging environments. Josh found himself sharing his own story in return, speaking about the loss of his family farm and his journey west in search of a new beginning. But, as he talked, he began to realize that his motivations had been more complex than simple economic necessity. He had been searching for something that he couldn't name, a sense of connection and purpose that had been missing from his previous life. The three women listened to his story with attention and understanding that surprised him. Despite the vast differences in their cultural backgrounds, they seemed to recognize something familiar in his search for meaning and belonging. Ayana suggested that his willingness to help them might be part of his own spiritual journey, a way of discovering what his true purpose was meant to be. As they entered the third day of their journey, the terrain became even more challenging and spectacular. Josh's route now led them through areas that few white men had ever seen, following ancient pathways that seemed to have been carved into the rock itself by generations of travelers who understood the landscape in ways that modern maps could never capture. The sacred canyon they were approaching was hidden in a region of complex geological formations that created natural mazes and provided numerous hiding places for anyone who needed to avoid detection. Josh had discovered the general area during his explorations but had never ventured into the specific canyon that was their destination, respecting what seemed to be clearly marked boundaries that warned outsiders away. As they drew closer to their goal, the behavior of his companions began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. Their conversations became more formal and ritual in nature, incorporating prayers and songs that seemed designed to prepare them spiritually for what lay ahead. The markings on their skin seemed to take on new significance, and Josh noticed that they were adding new symbols and patterns using materials they had gathered during their journey. Xochitl, in particular, was undergoing a transformation that was remarkable to observe. The shy young woman who had seemed almost overwhelmed by the physical demands of their journey was gradually revealing a strength and determination that spoke of hidden depths and untapped potential. Her existing markings seemed to be guiding her toward an understanding of her own capabilities and the role she was meant to play in her tribe's future. On the evening before they were scheduled to reach the sacred canyon, the three women performed a ceremony that was unlike anything Josh had witnessed before. Using pigments made from local minerals and plants, they added new markings to each other's skin while singing songs that seemed to connect them to spiritual forces that Josh could sense but not fully understand. When they invited him to participate in a modified version of the ceremony, Josh felt both honored and overwhelmed by the responsibility they were placing on him. The markings they added to his existing symbols were more elaborate and permanent than what he had received before, using techniques that would ensure the designs lasted for several months rather than just a few weeks. As Ayana worked on the intricate patterns that now covered much of his face and hands, she explained that these new markings identified him not just as a guide and protector, but as someone who had proven himself worthy of deeper trust and knowledge. The designs incorporated elements that told the story of their journey together and acknowledged his growing understanding of their culture and values. That night, as they camped within sight of the canyon that was their destination, Josh experienced the most powerful visions yet of what his life might become if he chose to embrace the connections he was discovering. He saw himself not just as a solitary rancher struggling to build something meaningful in isolation, but as someone who could serve as a bridge between worlds that had been driven apart by misunderstanding and conflict. The markings on his skin seemed to pulse with energy and meaning, connecting him to the landscape and to his companions in ways that transcended simple friendship or alliance. He began to understand that his decision to help these three women had set in motion changes that would affect not just their immediate mission, but the entire course of his future life. As dawn approached, bringing with it the final day of their journey and the beginning of Xochitl's coming-of-age ceremony, Josh realized that he too was undergoing a transformation that would mark his own transition into a new understanding of who he was meant to be. The temporary markings had become something much more permanent in their significance, representing commitments and connections that would shape his decisions for years to come. The sacred canyon revealed itself at dawn like a secret whispered by the earth itself. As they crested the final ridge of their journey, Josh found himself looking down into a natural amphitheater carved from red sandstone that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The walls rose in graceful curves toward the sky, creating an enclosed space that felt both intimate and infinite, protected yet open to the heavens above. Ancient pictographs covered the canyon walls, their meanings lost to time but their power undeniable. These were not the simple hunting scenes or territorial markers that Josh had encountered elsewhere, but complex narratives that seemed to tell stories spanning countless generations. Spirals and geometric patterns intertwined with figures that might have been human, animal, or something altogether different. Ayana explained that this place had been sacred to her people since time beyond memory, a location where young women came to receive the visions that would guide their adult lives. The canyon's unique acoustics and its orientation to celestial movements created conditions that were believed to facilitate communication with spiritual guides who could reveal hidden truths and future possibilities. As they descended into the canyon, Josh noticed that the markings on the three women's skin seemed to resonate with the ancient symbols on the walls. It was as if the designs they wore were part of a continuous conversation that had been going on for centuries, each generation adding new chapters to stories that connected past, present, and future in ways that defied simple understanding. The preparation for Xochitl's ceremony required 2 full days of ritual cleansing, prayer, and meditation. Josh was amazed to discover that his role in these preparations was far more involved than he had expected. The temporary markings he had accepted had evolved into something much more significant, identifying him as someone who had been accepted into the sacred circle surrounding this important transition. Ayana and Itzel worked together to create an elaborate ceremonial space in the center of the canyon, using stones, plants, and other natural materials to form patterns that echoed the designs on their skin and the ancient symbols on the canyon walls. Each element was placed with careful attention to its position relative to the sun, stars, and cardinal directions, creating a kind of three-dimensional mandala that would focus spiritual energy for the ceremony ahead. Josh found himself assigned tasks that required him to gather specific plants and minerals from locations within the canyon that the women identified with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural. They seemed to know exactly where to find rare herbs that grew only in certain microclimates, stones with particular qualities that were essential for the ritual, and water from springs that had special significance in their traditions. As he carried out these assignments, Josh began to experience a deepening connection to the natural world around him that went far beyond anything he had felt during his years of solitary ranching. The markings on his skin seemed to serve as conduits for perceptions and understandings that challenged his previous assumptions about the relationship between human consciousness and the larger patterns of existence. During the first evening in the canyon, as they sat around a carefully constructed fire that cast dancing shadows on the ancient walls, Xochitl began to share the fears and hopes that surrounded her coming ceremony. Through the mixture of languages they had developed, she spoke of dreams that had been troubling her sleep for months, visions that seemed to suggest her life path would involve challenges and responsibilities that she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. The markings she already bore told of artistic abilities and spiritual sensitivity, but the full extent of her gifts would only be revealed through the vision quest she was about to undertake. Like other young women before her, she would spend 3 days and nights alone in a sacred cave at the far end of the canyon, fasting and meditating until she received the guidance that would determine her adult role within the tribe. Josh listened to her concerns with growing understanding of the weight of tradition and expectation that surrounded this ceremony. In his own culture, the transition from childhood to adulthood was often marked by economic milestones rather than spiritual revelations, but he was beginning to appreciate the wisdom of a system that required young people to actively seek their life purpose rather than simply accepting whatever circumstances happened to provide. The second day brought unexpected complications that tested everyone's commitment to the ceremony. A group of territorial militia appeared on the ridge above the canyon, apparently tracking some unrelated conflict but clearly suspicious of any Native American activity they might encounter. From their concealed position within the canyon, Josh and his companions could see at least 6 armed men making camp in a location that would allow them to monitor the area for several days. The presence of potentially hostile forces within striking distance of their sacred space created a crisis that required immediate decision-making. The ceremony could not be postponed without losing the crucial lunar alignment that made it effective, but proceeding with armed men nearby would put everyone at serious risk if they were discovered. After extensive consultation, the 3 women made a decision that demonstrated both their commitment to their traditions and their trust in Josh's growing role as their protector. They would proceed with the ceremony as planned, but Josh would need to take on the dangerous responsibility of monitoring the militia and, if necessary, creating distractions that would keep them away from the canyon during the crucial 3 days of Xochitl's vision quest. This assignment required Josh to climb out of the canyon during the night and establish a hidden observation post from which he could watch the militia camp without being detected. The markings on his skin, which had originally seemed like exotic decorations, now served a practical purpose by helping him blend with the natural shadows and rock formations that provided concealment. From his hiding place among the boulders above the militia camp, Josh could observe their activities and listen to their conversations. What he learned filled him with both relief and concern. The soldiers were not specifically tracking Apache movements, but were instead searching for a group of Mexican bandits who had been raiding settlements further south. However, their leader was clearly hostile to any Native American presence in the territory and would undoubtedly view the ceremony below as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Josh spent the next 3 days maintaining his vigilant watch while the ceremony proceeded in the canyon below. During the daylight hours, he could occasionally catch glimpses of ritual activities taking place around the sacred cave where Xochitl had begun her vision quest. Smoke from ceremonial fires drifted up the canyon walls, carrying with it the sense of burning herbs that seemed designed to facilitate spiritual communication. The isolation of his vigil gave Josh time to reflect on the extraordinary changes that had taken place in his life since the 3 Apache women had first appeared at his ranch. The markings on his skin had evolved from temporary symbols into permanent reminders of commitments and connections that went far beyond simple friendship or cultural curiosity. He was now responsible for protecting something sacred, and that responsibility had awakened parts of his character that he hadn't known existed. On the second night of his watch, Josh experienced visions of his own that seemed to parallel what Xochitl was undergoing in the canyon below. The markings on his skin appeared to serve as conduits for perceptions that transcended normal sensory experience, allowing him to sense the presence of spiritual forces that were gathering around the ceremony site. These visions showed him possible futures that stretched far beyond the immediate crisis they were facing. He saw himself continuing to serve as a bridge between the Apache people and the white settlers who were transforming the territory, using his unique position to prevent conflicts and facilitate understanding between groups that seemed destined for endless warfare. The images were both inspiring and terrifying, suggesting that his life was meant to take directions he had never imagined. The solitary ranch that had represented security and independence now seemed like just the first step in a journey that would require him to risk everything he had built in service of causes larger than his personal ambitions. On the morning of the 3rd day, the militia finally broke camp and moved south, apparently having received new information about the bandits they were tracking. Josh waited until they were completely out of sight before making his way back down into the canyon, where he found Ayana and Itzel maintaining their own vigil outside the sacred cave where Xochitl was completing her vision quest. The 2 women greeted his return with expressions of relief and gratitude, but also with a new level of respect that acknowledged how his role in their mission had evolved during the dangerous days of his solitary watch. The markings on his skin had taken on new depths of color and complexity during his time on the ridge, as if the spiritual forces surrounding the ceremony had added their own contributions to his evolving identity. When Xochitl finally emerged from the sacred cave, she was visibly transformed by her 3 days of fasting, meditation, and spiritual communication. The shy young woman who had begun the journey was now someone who moved with confidence and purpose, carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had received important revelations about her life path and responsibilities. The markings that covered her skin had multiplied during her time in the cave, creating intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories of visions and spiritual encounters that would guide her adult life. But, more importantly, her eyes now held a depth of understanding and determination that spoke of someone who had accepted difficult truths about the role she was meant to play in her people's future. Through their evolving communication system, Xochitl shared some of what she had experienced during her vision quest. She had been shown possible futures for her tribe that ranged from extinction through cultural assimilation to renewal through adaptation and alliance building with sympathetic outsiders who could help preserve essential traditions while embracing necessary changes. Her visions had specifically included images of Josh and the role he was meant to play in facilitating understanding between Apache people and white settlers who were willing to respect native rights and traditions. The markings she now bore identified her as someone chosen to work toward reconciliation and mutual understanding, rather than the continuation of conflicts that threatened to destroy both cultures. The completion of the ceremony required one final ritual that would bind all 4 participants together in commitments that extended far beyond their current mission. Using pigments that had been blessed during Xochitl's vision quest, they added final markings to each other's skin that told the story of their shared journey and acknowledged the obligations they were accepting for the future. Josh found himself receiving markings that identified him not just as a temporary ally, but as someone who had been permanently adopted into relationships and responsibilities that would define the rest of his life. The symbols that now covered his hands, arms, and face told of his transformation from solitary rancher to someone committed to serving as a bridge between worlds that needed each other's wisdom and strength. As they prepared to leave the sacred canyon and begin their journey back to the world of everyday conflicts and challenges, Josh realized that he could never return to his previous life of isolation and single-minded focus on personal goals. The markings on his skin were now permanent reminders of commitments that transcended individual ambitions and connected him to purposes larger than anything he had previously imagined. The 3 women who had appeared at his ranch as strangers seeking passage through his land were now family members whose welfare and missions would guide his decisions for years to come. More importantly, they had awakened in him an understanding of his own potential to contribute to healing and reconciliation in a territory that seemed destined for endless conflict. The journey back to his ranch would take them through some of the same terrain they had covered on their way to the canyon, but Josh knew that he would never see that landscape in the same way again. The markings on his skin had changed not just his appearance but his entire perception of his relationship to the land, to other people, and to the spiritual forces that shaped events in ways that rational analysis could never fully explain. The return journey from the sacred canyon became a pilgrimage of understanding that transformed everything Josh thought he knew about his place in the world. The markings that now adorned his skin seemed to serve as both map and compass, guiding him toward insights that challenged every assumption he had held about the relationship between individual success and larger purposes. As they traveled back through the hidden pathways that had brought them safely to their destination, Josh began to understand that the 3 Apache women had not simply been seeking his help as a guide, they had been following their own spiritual instructions to find someone who could serve as a bridge between their world and the rapidly changing society that threatened to overwhelm their traditions. Xochitl's transformation during the vision quest had revealed her calling as a keeper of ancient knowledge, someone whose responsibility would be to preserve essential wisdom while finding ways to share it with others who could benefit from its insights. The markings she now bore identified her as someone who had received visions of cooperative futures that seemed impossible given the current levels of conflict and misunderstanding between Apache people and white settlers. Ayana, as the eldest and most experienced of the 3 women, had accepted the role of teacher and guide for this new phase of cultural adaptation. Her markings told of years spent learning traditional healing arts and spiritual practices that were increasingly difficult to maintain as their people were forced to adapt to reservation life and government policies designed to eliminate rather than preserve native cultures. Itzel had emerged from the ceremony with markings that identified her as a warrior whose battles would be fought not with weapons but with words and alliances, someone who would work to protect her people by building relationships with sympathetic outsiders who could provide protection and support during the difficult transitions ahead. The return to Josh's ranch brought them back into contact with the everyday realities of territorial life, but their experiences in the sacred canyon had created bonds and commitments that transcended ordinary social boundaries. The markings they all bore now served as permanent reminders of obligations that would guide their decisions for years to come. During their first evening back at the ranch, the 4 companions spent hours discussing the practical implications of what had taken place during their journey. The visions received during Xochitl's ceremony had provided guidance about specific actions and alliances that needed to be developed, but implementing those insights would require careful planning and considerable courage from everyone involved. Josh learned that his ranch was strategically positioned to serve as a safe haven and meeting place for Apache people who needed to travel through the territory for both traditional and practical purposes. The hidden pathways they had used to reach the sacred canyon were part of a larger network that connected important sites and communities across hundreds of miles of challenging terrain. His willingness to accept the markings that identified him as a friend and protector had opened possibilities for cooperation that could benefit both Apache people struggling to maintain their traditions and white settlers who were genuinely interested in peaceful coexistence rather than domination and exploitation. The women explained that there were other ranchers and settlers in the territory who had shown similar willingness to build respectful relationships with native people, but coordinating these scattered individuals into an effective network would require someone who could move freely in both worlds without arousing suspicion or hostility from extremists on either side. Josh's position as an established rancher with a reputation for fairness and self-reliance gave him credibility with white settlers, while the markings he now bore would identify him to Apache people as someone who could be trusted with sensitive information and important responsibilities. Over the following weeks, as summer gave way to autumn, Josh's ranch became an unofficial center for activities that gradually expanded his understanding of the role he had accepted. Apache travelers began appearing with increasing frequency, always arriving by the hidden pathways that avoided main routes where they might encounter hostile militia or suspicious neighbors. Each visitor brought news of developments throughout the territory, conflicts that were escalating, opportunities for peaceful resolution that were emerging, and information about government policies that would affect the welfare of all people trying to build stable lives in an unstable region. Josh found himself serving not just as a host and guide, but as a communication center that helped coordinate responses to changing conditions. His markings had evolved to include symbols that indicated his growing knowledge of Apache customs and his increasing responsibilities within their extended community. The most challenging aspect of his new role came when he had to begin reaching out to white settlers who might be sympathetic to Apache concerns but who had no framework for understanding the spiritual and cultural dimensions of native traditions. His own transformation from skeptical rancher to marked participant in Apache ceremonies gave him unique credibility for these delicate negotiations. The first major test of this expanding network came when territorial officials announced plans for a new road that would cut directly through several sacred sites, including areas near the canyon where Xochitl had received her visions. The proposed route would not only destroy locations that were irreplaceable to Apache people, but would also open previously protected areas to development and settlement that could eliminate entire ecosystems that supported both traditional lifestyles and wildlife populations. Josh found himself coordinating a response that brought together Apache leaders, sympathetic white settlers, and even some government officials who were beginning to understand that cooperation might be more effective than confrontation for achieving lasting peace in the territory. The campaign to modify the proposed road route required months of careful negotiation and relationship building, during which Josh's unique position as someone who was trusted by both communities proved invaluable. His markings had become so elaborate and meaningful that they served as a form of credentials that immediately identified him to Apache people as someone who had earned the right to speak on important matters. The success of this effort led to Josh's recognition as an unofficial mediator whose services were sought by various parties trying to resolve conflicts that seemed impossible to address through normal legal and political channels. His ranch became a neutral ground where representatives from different communities could meet without the suspicions and hostilities that made cooperation difficult in more public settings. Ayana, Itzel, and Xochitl became regular residents at the ranch, using it as a base for their own expanding activities as teachers, healers, and cultural ambassadors. The markings they had received during their sacred ceremony continued to evolve as they took on new responsibilities and gained new insights through their work. Xochitl's artistic abilities proved particularly valuable for documenting traditional knowledge in forms that could be preserved and shared with future generations. Her markings had developed into intricate patterns that served as both personal decoration and practical notation system for recording important information about medicinal plants, seasonal cycles, and spiritual practices. Itzel's talents as a tracker and scout made her invaluable for maintaining the network of hidden pathways that allowed Apache people to travel safely throughout the territory. Her markings had evolved to include detailed maps and navigational information that helped her guide others through areas that were becoming increasingly dangerous due to military patrols and hostile settlers. Ayana's role as a keeper of traditional healing knowledge brought a steady stream of people seeking treatments for ailments that conventional medicine couldn't address. Her markings had become so complex and beautiful that they attracted attention even from white settlers who gradually began to appreciate the depth of knowledge and skill they represented. The ranch itself was transformed by their presence into something that resembled a traditional Apache camp more than a conventional white settlement. Additional structures were built using traditional techniques that provided better adaptation to desert conditions while creating spaces that could accommodate the ceremonies and teaching activities that became increasingly frequent as their reputation spread. Josh's own markings continued to evolve as he gained new skills and accepted additional responsibilities. He learned to read the natural signs that indicated weather changes, seasonal transitions, and the presence of both helpful and dangerous forces in the landscape around them. More importantly, he developed abilities to facilitate communication and understanding between people whose worldviews had previously seemed completely incompatible. The markings on his skin served as constant reminders of the commitments he had made and the trust that had been placed in him by people who had risked everything to share their most sacred knowledge with an outsider. The transformation of his life from solitary rancher to central figure in a network of cooperation and cultural preservation brought challenges that tested every aspect of his character. There were times when the pressure of mediating between conflicting interests seemed almost unbearable, and moments when the violence and hatred that surrounded their efforts threatened to destroy everything they had built. But the markings that covered his skin served as sources of strength and guidance during these difficult periods, reminding him of the visions and commitments that had brought him to this point and connecting him to spiritual resources that sustained him when purely human efforts seemed insufficient. As winter approached, bringing with it the first anniversary of his meeting with the 3 Apache women, Josh reflected on the extraordinary changes that had taken place in his understanding of what his life was meant to accomplish. The lonely ranch that had once represented his only ambition had become the center of activities that affected the welfare of hundreds of people across the territory. The markings that had begun as temporary symbols of cooperation had evolved into permanent records of transformation that connected him not just to his Apache friends, but to traditions and responsibilities that stretched back through countless generations and forward into a future that would require continued courage and wisdom from everyone involved. The line he had drawn around his property to mark his personal boundaries had expanded into a network of relationships and commitments that encompassed vast areas of both physical and spiritual territory. His salvation had come not through isolation and self-reliance, but through accepting connections and responsibilities that had transformed his entire understanding of what it meant to build a meaningful life. Looking at Ayanna, Itzel, and Xochitl as they prepared for another ceremony that would mark the changing of seasons and the continuation of traditions that had sustained their people through countless challenges, Josh understood that his own journey was just beginning. The markings on his skin would continue to evolve as he faced new challenges and accepted new responsibilities in service of causes that were larger than any individual ambitions. The 3 Apache women who had appeared at his ranch seeking passage through his land had indeed turned into his salvation, but not in any way he could have imagined. They had saved him from a life of meaningless isolation by showing him connections and purposes that gave everyday significance beyond mere survival and accumulation. His salvation lay in the understanding that the markings on his skin were not just decorations or even just symbols, but living connections to forces and relationships that would continue to guide and sustain him through whatever challenges the future might bring. The cowboy who had once drawn lines to keep the world at bay had learned to draw new kinds of lines that brought people together rather than keeping them apart.